At the beginning of the 20th century, the most powerful empire on Earth looked at its navy, its trade routes, its industrial strength, and its global map of colonies, and realized something deeply unsettling. Coal had built the British Empire, but would it be enough to keep it alive? The next war would not be decided solely by ships, territory, or manpower. It would be about resources. It would be about ascent. It would be about supply. It would be about whether a state could move its modern machines fast enough, far enough, and long enough to endure and outlast its enemy. That is why the First World War was not only the last great imperial war of the Old World, it was also the first global war of oil. Welcome to MoneyHistoria, where money, power, and history collide, and where what you see is never as simple as what truly is. To understand why petroleum became so important, you have to look just before the war, when the world was still running on coal. Coal-powered factories, railways, merchant fleets, and the massive battleships that symbolized imperial dominance. Britain's vast coal reserves were one of the key reasons it had dominated the 19th century. Coal was not just fuel, it was influence, leverage, and security. But oil offered something coal never could. It carried more energy per unit, could be loaded faster. It enabled quicker acceleration. It required fewer men to operate. And perhaps most importantly, it gave warships a level of speed, flexibility, and endurance that coal-powered fleets could never fully match. These were not minor advantages. They were transformative. They redefined what naval power could look like in a modern war. Winston Churchill, despite Britain lacking a comfortable domestic oil supply, pushed relentlessly to convert the Royal Navy from coal to oil. It was a controversial decision. It was risky. It meant dependence on foreign resources. But Churchill understood something others were only beginning to grasp. The future of warfare would belong to those who mastered energy, not just those who possessed territory. By 1914, the British Parliament approved investment in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, securing fuel for the Navy. The state took control and directly tied its strategic future to petroleum. This was not a technical adjustment. It was not a simple economic move. It was a declaration. Energy had become a matter of national survival. And that is where the deeper story begins. Because once an army, a navy, or an entire economy reorganizes itself around a new energy source, it is no longer simply purchasing fuel. It is reshaping its foreign policy. It is redefining what lands matter, which companies matter, which sea lanes matter. It is deciding which distant region, once irrelevant, suddenly becomes vital. A pipeline in Persia, a terminal in the Gulf, or an oil field in a remote region could now matter to London almost as much as a dockyard in Portsmouth. Oil collapsed distance. It turned geography into strategy at industrial speed. It made the far feel dangerously close, and the previously insignificant suddenly essential. This is one of the hidden rules of modern power. Once a resource becomes essential to an empire, it does not remain local. It becomes political. Then it becomes military. And if necessary, it becomes moral, dressed in language that makes strategic necessity sound like virtue. When war broke out in August 1914, Europe still appeared, at first glance, like a continent fighting with the tools of the past. Railways dominated mobilization. Horses carried supplies. Artillery thundered across battlefields. Soldiers wore uniforms that seemed rooted in another century. And in many ways, this image was accurate. But beneath the surface, everything was already changing. Trucks, cars, tanks, submarines, and aircraft were emerging as new instruments of war, and all of them depended on oil. Mobility was no longer an advantage. It was becoming a requirement. Range was no longer a luxury. It was becoming destiny. Mechanical warfare was no longer theoretical. It was real, chaotic, unreliable, and desperately hungry for fuel. The war began in a world shaped by coal, but it ended in a world that had glimpsed the future, and that future smelled like petroleum. This shift gave the Entente powers a critical advantage. They controlled more than 70% of global petroleum production. That number is not just a statistic, it is a strategic reality. Because wars are not won by brilliance alone. They are won by systems that can keep machines running, supply lines moving, troops fed, and losses replaced. Oil did not replace everything in the First World War, but it determined who could adapt and who would fall behind. The Allies were not necessarily smarter. They were simply better positioned within the emerging energy structure of modern warfare. And history often works that way. It is not always the most virtuous side that prevails, but it is often the side with the strongest logistics. Britain understood this early, particularly in the Middle East. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war, British strategy shifted rapidly toward Mesopotamia. The logic was clear and unapologetically direct. Protect the oil near Basra. In November 1914, British and Indian forces landed and captured Basra, followed by Kurna. These actions reveal something important. They strip away the romantic narratives of war. Before the speeches, before the ideals, before the justifications, there was calculation. If oil mattered, then the routes to oil mattered. Mesopotamia was no longer peripheral. It was integrated into the very survival of the empire. Meanwhile, the Central Powers faced the opposite reality. They had access to oil, but not enough. They had resources, but not security. They had potential, but not control. And modern warfare punishes precisely these weaknesses. This is why Baku became so critical. This is why Romania became a strategic focal point. This is why retreating forces destroyed oil infrastructure to deny it to the enemy. Because oil was not just a resource. It was time. And in war, the side that controls time often controls the outcome. Tanks, aircraft, and logistics networks all reinforce the same truth. Mechanical warfare demands fuel. Without it, strategy collapses into limitation. By 1918, the pattern was undeniable. Oil was no longer a supporting factor. It had become a necessity. And yet, the phrase, the secret war for oil, still holds meaning. Not because oil was unknown, everyone understood its existence, but because it existed one layer beneath the public narrative. Governments spoke of honor, alliances, balance, and defense. All of those factors were real, but beneath them lay something colder. Dependency. Britain's investment in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company blurred the line between state power and private enterprise. This was not merely business. It was strategy. It was control. It was power expressed through economic structure. And the lesson of the war was lasting. Petroleum was not just a commodity. It had become a pillar of modern sovereignty. Today, the names have changed. The technologies have evolved. But the structure remains the same. Oil, gas, rare earth elements, semiconductors, whatever the resource, the principle does not change. If a system depends on it, a state will eventually use power to secure it. It is easy to believe that wars are decided on the battlefield. It is comforting to think they are won by courage, leadership, or tactical brilliance. And those things do matter. But the deeper truth is quieter. Who has the fuel? Who can transport it? Who can withstand disruption? Who is dependent on a fragile supply chain they do not control? These questions decide more than speeches ever will. Real power is not what functions during stability. It is what continues to function during disruption. The First World War was not just a catastrophe of trenches and artillery. It was also a turning point in economic and industrial history. A war fought by coal-era empires accelerated into a petroleum-driven future. And the most unsettling lesson is this: the nations that dominate an era are usually the ones that recognize the next critical resource before everyone else is forced to. Britain saw the limits of coal and moved toward oil. Imperfectly, cautiously, but decisively. Others hesitated. Others improvised. Others tried to seize what they had failed to secure. And history tends to punish in a very specific way. Not because you chose the wrong asset, but because you misunderstood what you were becoming dependent on. By the time the public understands, the map has already changed. History does not repeat itself, but if you fail to understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this perspective changed the way you see the world, consider subscribing. The answers are already written in history. I will show you where to look.